You know, one of the things that's interesting in the past year and a half, personally for me, maybe you relate, is I started to get into things that I was never into before. Any of you have this where you're like into something now that was kind of catalyzed through the lockdown or through kind of the summer of last year? And one of the things that I got into was a YouTube TV show. Now, you may not even know that YouTube has TV shows. They do. They're just content creators that put out these episodes. It is a 15-minute long show. It's called The Pond Guy. You know what he does? Builds ponds. And I love it. He built Shaquille O'Neal a pond, which was amazing because I love Shaquille O'Neal, and the pond is fabulous. He also built $1 million pond. Can you imagine that? $1 million pond. Like one of the fish was like, had gold on it. It was unbelievable. And I like it because the script follows a very familiar script. If you've watched, Extreme Makeover Home Edition or Fixer Upper, there's a lot of shows. There's like Treehouse Masters or something, which is a guy building tree houses. And they follow the similar script, which is this. Someone contracts them to build a tree house, a pond, to fix up their home. They're really passionate about it. And it moves all throughout the episode to what at the end? The big reveal. The big reveal to see something that came out of nothing, to see something redone or fixed up, or a brand new pond in Shaquille O'Neal's yard. And everything moves to that moment, and it captures our imagination because we as people love a finished product. We love when something is completed and finished, and we imagine ourselves enjoying that, enjoying the new house, enjoying the new pond in the yard. I think about myself sitting out there, sun setting by the fire pit, looking at my fish, listening to the waterfall. I know this will never happen, but I imagine, and I enjoyed it, especially when I was living in Brickell this past year, sitting on my balcony, hearing just sirens go off. Like, wouldn't it be nice to have a pond? And this is kind of how we move through life, many of us. As we're moving into chapter 2 and chapter 3 of the book of Ecclesiastes, the Koheleth, or the preacher, as the English translation says, is going to tell us about his quest for pleasure and what he did in his life to try to find lasting pleasure. And many of us kind of follow the script of these TV shows in our life. We think, if I just work hard, if I make hard decisions, if I make sacrifices in my life, and if I work through some of the difficulties, ultimately I will come to the great big reveal in my career, in my family, for my kids, in my retirement. One day I'll get to the great big reveal where I'll be able to sit back and relax and enjoy it all. But if you watch those shows, you know that there's another very similar thing that happens. About midway through the show, the person that wants the pond or the treehouse or the home fixed cannot wait. They cannot wait for the big reveal. They get impatient and they start to interject. So they creep out of the house and try to see what's going on, and then they start to tell the person building, they don't like that, go get a different rock, I don't like that fish, I don't like those finishes, I don't like that wall color, and it always frustrates the person that's building it. Because they don't want to wait. They want to have pleasure now, they want to enjoy what they're building now, and they want to have the pleasure of the great big reveal, the finished product. And this is true of us too, right? As we pursue pleasure, we have this imagination that as we work hard and make sacrifices, we'll have the great big reveal in our life. We'll finally be satisfied and content, full of pleasure, but we're impatient as well. So we want pleasure in the process, not only in the future, but also in the process. And so we reroute our lives. We change things. We adjust things. We complain, I don't like that, let me adjust this. Because we're constantly searching for pleasure in the moment, and we certainly desire it in the future. Well, the preacher, the Koheleth here, is going to lead us through his journey in pursuing pleasure, which he thought would happen one day at the great big reveal in his life, but also he sought day in and day out. So verse 1, chapter 2, he says this. I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with pleasure. Enjoy yourself. But behold, spoiler alert, this was also vanity. So he says, let me tell you how I thought about my life. I didn't restrict myself from anything. I said to myself, I said to my heart, enjoy yourself. Do whatever feels good. And he's going to tell you what he arrived at before he even takes you on the journey. And he says that at the end of it all, he felt like it was vanity. The word there, as we said last week, is hevel in Hebrew, which means vapor. It was fleeting. It was temporary. It did not last. So he says in verse 2, here's how he began to think about the quest for pleasure. I said of laughter, it is mad. And of pleasure, what use is it? See, ultimately, he arrives at this place where he thinks to himself that it is maddening to pursue pleasure in the way that he has because it feels useless. He feels like he wasted his life. He was chasing after these fleeting vapors. And so, being a good philosopher, which he is, he's going to take you and I on this journey to see exactly what it looked like, exactly what he pursued to find pleasure in life. So, chapter 3, we have step 1. He says this in chapter 3, I searched with my heart how to cheer my body with wine, my heart still guiding me with wisdom, and how to lay hold on folly, till I might see what was good for the children of man to do under heaven during the few days of their life. So he says here that what I've been contemplating is for the few days of our life, under heaven or under the sun, what do we do? What do we pursue to find pleasure? And he says, step 1, I drank a lot of wine. It's what it reads like. He's like, step 1, turn up. Step 1, party. I'm just going to drink a lot. He said, I'm going to cheer my body with wine. But it's actually deeper than that. It's not just like he thought, let me just drink a bunch of wine and think that it's going to make me happy. In the Hebrew language here, it's attached to actually becoming a learner of wine. So he became a connoisseur of wine. He learned how to swirl it around, smell it, sniff it, do that weird thing where they gargle it. You know, people really into wine, you're like, well, that's weird. Don't do that. He learned the type of grapes and the sun exposure of the year, and he learned everything. See, what he's saying here is the first thing that he put his time and his attention to were personal hobbies. Let me figure out what I'm passionate about, what I'm interested in, and I'm going to pursue that full on. I'm going to take every liberty. I'm going to try to enjoy it and see if it brings about pleasure. And he says it didn't. It was fleeting. It was a vapor. Okay, so step 2, which is in verse 4 through 6. Secondly, I made great works. I built houses and planted vineyards for myself. I made myself gardens and parks and planted in them all kinds of fruit trees. I made myself pools from which to water the forest of growing trees. Step 2 is the pursuit of building something. He was focused on building. He says here that I built vineyards. I built palaces. I built gardens. I was trying to literally build paradise for myself. And one of the things that Solomon, who's the most likely author here, because he's a son of David and a king in Jerusalem, and he was a philosopher type, he built something called the Palace of the Forest, which was at the entrance to the king's grounds and the king's palace. And what he did was he brought in cedars of Lebanon, which were some of the most famous and beautiful trees in the world. So much so that I have one tattooed on my arm. That's how much I like cedars of Lebanon. So did Solomon. He brought them into Jerusalem and he built them. So when you walked into the castle grounds and the palace, it's as if you're walking through a forest. He was literally building paradise. He says it was fleeting. You see, the reason he's telling us all of this is because he's warning us to not fall into the same trap that he did, to pursue hobbies for pleasure, to pursue building. What a trap that we find ourselves falling into, right? If I can just purchase this home one day, if I can just live in this building, if I can just retire in this location, then I will find pleasure and be happy. He says it's vanity. I built everything you could possibly imagine, and it did nothing for me. But it wasn't just that he built paradise for himself, or attempted to. It's also that he speaks about the innovations that he created that actually brought amazing change in the world. See, he says here that he built pools from which to water the plants. Really what Solomon is credited for is building water reservoirs that he was able to use to water the fields. And the Romans expanded upon this and built the aqueducts. So he built a game-changing innovation that brought about great prosperity in the fields and in the region. He says, I still felt empty. See, that's another thing that we think, right? It's maybe not only the house I want to buy or the building I want to live in or where I want to retire. It's also, I'm going to put my whole life and all of my attention into building something for my career or in my field. Or I'm going to create some technology, or I'm going to innovate in some way to where I'm going to have this mark on my life as someone who built something incredible, lasting. He says it is not. It's fleeting. It did not stick around. So he goes on to step 3, which is verse 7. He says, I bought male and female slaves and had slaves who were born in my house. I had also great possessions of herds and flocks, more than any who had been before me in Jerusalem. Now, before I explain what he's saying here, I want to clear up a misconception, because if I do not, you will hear nothing else in this sermon. And that is the servitude culture of Solomon's day and in Old Testament times. And it's important that we understand this, because the horror of the slavery in our history, in American history, is chattel race-based slavery. And this is not what he's speaking about here. It is not the slavery of the Old Testament, the way that we read about it, as he says, I had male and female slaves. This is indentured servitude. It's like an employer and an employee relationship. There was 2 types of options for those that were slaves or servants. The one was they would work for 7 years for their boss, their employer, and they would accumulate money. They would live, they were expected to be treated fairly, and after 7 years, they could leave, take all the money they've earned, and go buy their own field, and then hire their own slaves to start their own company. It was an agricultural-based economy. Or, if they wanted to, they would become what is called a bond servant. Maybe you've heard that term before, which is where they would commit themselves for the rest of their lives to serve the family or to serve the employer, the boss, the master in their life, because they loved where they worked. And it was a job where they were paid, and they had their own house, they had their own place to stay. Now, I'm not saying that the servitude culture of the Old Testament, it was free of oppression or it was ideal. Certainly not. But I think it's important to clarify, it's not the same thing as this race-based chattel slavery that we have experienced in our history here. In fact, the Bible speaks out against that form of slavery. In Exodus 21, verse 16, here's what it says. Whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him, shall be put to death. It's pretty clear. The Bible speaks out against that form of slavery across the landscape of Scripture. In fact, saying that a death penalty is deserving of those who will take people as possession and steal them. And so I want to clarify that so you understand what he's saying here. He's saying that he had a lot of people that worked for him. He had a lot of servants. It was visible to everyone that he was successful. So he's saying that the third pursuit in his life was visible success. When you looked at him, you saw how much he has accumulated, the herds and the livestock and all the people that worked for him. People wanted to work for him. People wanted to be around him. People wanted to be a part of the companies and the innovations that he was creating. He had visible success, and it was vain. What another trap for us, right? If I can just be viewed as successful, then I'll find pleasure. If people will look at me and they'll see my title, or they'll see what I've accumulated, then they will say, wow, this person is incredible. This person is special. This person is bright. And I'll feel pleasure from that. So sometimes we think that, right? If people want to work for me, if people esteem me, if people tell me how great I am and how successful I am, then I'll be happy. He says it doesn't work. It was empty. So he goes to the next step, step 4, pretty straightforward. I gathered for myself silver and gold, verse 8, and the treasure of kings and provinces. He says the 4th step was I just tried to make a lot of money. and he made a lot of money. He was not only visibly successful, but he had everything you could possibly want. He could purchase anything. He was importing trees from Lebanon. He was like the Jeff Bezos of his time. Anything he wanted, he could have. Money didn't do it. Now, this one right here, culture we kind of jive with. Right? It's like money can't buy happiness. We have that slogan. But I want to give you a challenge. Because I think most of us, if we went around the room and said, do you think money could buy happiness, could buy pleasure? You'd be like, no. I want you to imagine that tomorrow, your income doubles. Do you think you'll be happier? Will you find more pleasure in life? You may say no, but do you feel no? Right? I mean, it's such a trap, right? We may say no, but then we feel yes, so we pursue money as a source of happiness and pleasure. And he's saying it's empty. It doesn't work. Lastly, the last thing that he pursued in the second half of verse 8, he says, I got singers, both men and women, and many concubines, the delight of the sons of man. Concubines, their role was to provide sexual pleasure. So he says that the next thing I poured myself into was sexual delight. I had singers, I had my own private concerts, I can create any kind of environment I wanted. I had no restrictions sexually at all. In fact, so much so that he says that my sexual lifestyle was the delight of men. It was envied. He had no restrictions, and it was empty. He felt like he wasted it all. He sums it all up in verse 9 through 10, the next two verses. Here's what happened in his life. It says, so I became great and surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem. And also my wisdom remains with me. And whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure, for my heart found pleasure in all my toil, and this was my reward for all my toil. See, I love that he says this, because when you hear his pursuit, that he found no lasting pleasure in the money he accumulated, in his sexual lifestyle, in what he was able to accumulate, and the visible success that he had in his life, or what he built for himself or for the world, or in the hobbies that he pursued, you think to yourself, okay, but it couldn't have been a miserable life. There's no way it could have been a miserable life. And his answer is, you're right. It wasn't miserable. He says that I had pleasure in my toil, that there was pleasure, there was happiness, but his point is that it was all fleeting. It was temporary. It did not last. As he pursued all of these different paths in his life and gave no restriction, and whatever his eye saw was good and he wanted to try, he did it. And he had pleasure, but it was momentary. And he ends by saying in verse 11, here's how he felt. Then I considered all that my hands had done, and the toil I had expended in doing it. And behold, all was vanity and striving after wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun. You see, as he begins to evaluate his life, he looks back and he says, I had a lot of great moments. I became great. In fact, I became greater than anybody else ever in Jerusalem in terms of what I accumulated, my success, my wealth, my lifestyle. I had moments of pleasure, but it, in the end, was fleeting. I felt like I gained nothing under the sun. It was all a vapor. It was all vanity. And herein lies the paradox of the human experience for every single one of us and every single person you know. The vapors in life, the pursuits in life that give you pleasure in the moment will never provide permanent pleasure. That's what frustrates us. We pursue something, a hobby or success or building something or romance and sex or money, and these things can give us happiness in a moment, pleasure for a moment or for a season, but it cannot ultimately satisfy. And it feels like it doesn't make sense. Albert Camus, who was a philosopher, he was a nihilist. I imagine he loved Ecclesiastes chapter 2. He says this: a man wants to earn money in order to be happy, and his whole effort and the best of a life are devoted to the earning of that money. Happiness is forgotten. The means are taken for the end. So he uses money as an example of what we pursue for pleasure. His answer, as an atheist, Albert Camus, is you make money your goal, you give the best of your life to that, and happiness will ultimately be forgotten. You've exchanged the means for the end. You've wasted your life. So we just go home now. There's nothing else to say. Ecclesiastes chapter 3, he begins to work through how he feels about his pursuits and really the wasting of a life. And he says this in verse 10 and 11 of chapter 3. He says, I have seen the business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. Isn't that interesting? The pursuits that he just listed are things that we just become busy with. Busy with accumulating all these different things to make us happy. But then he says, he has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. See, what he's saying is this, that we become busy with all of these pursuits in life, seeking satisfaction, permanent happiness, permanent pleasure. But when we chase after the wrong things, they're vapors, they're vain, they're fleeting. And he said this all derives from the very fact that God has placed eternity in our heart. That we have a desire within us for the end of things, where we'll be fully satisfied and we'll experience permanent pleasure. That's in our heart. We're made for eternity. But we can't see the end, and God has hidden it from us. You know, one of the most frustrating things in the world for me, and maybe you resonate, is traffic. Can I get an amen on that one? Amen. Especially here in Miami. And here's what happens to me. I'm driving down 95, feeling good, listening to music, and all of a sudden I look ahead and I see red lights. My heart sings a little bit. Because I don't know what's going on. So I try to get there as fast as possible. And when I get to the traffic and now I'm stopped, here's what I do. I do two things. Step one, I do the little swerve around the car. Do you do this? You swerve around and you look, can I see where the traffic ends? If I cannot, then I pull up Google and I look on the map and I see, how far is this? Now, if I can see the end of the traffic, or if I can see that it's just a little bit here on Google Maps, settle down. Calm down. It's okay, Carter. Put the song back on. Relax. You'll be out of it 10, 15 minutes. But if I cannot see the end of the traffic, and if it's like a red line up to Broward, I panic. I start thinking, what do I do? What exit can I get off on? Can I reroute? And then I notice everyone's going off on that exit. So now, that's not going to work either, because I'm going to be stuck on that exit. I don't even know where to go from there. I'm going to go through all these. It's going to take just as long. Then sometimes I think this is not recommended. Should I go in the emergency lane? Is there a cop? Because if there's a cop, then I got the consequences of that, but I can maybe try to cut through. I don't know, maybe. You know that in Miami, because a lot of people say, oh, those cones that divide the express lane from the normal lane, those are optional. Boom, plow through the cones, go right over, right? Because when there's traffic and you can't see the end and you don't know when you're going to get out of it, you start to panic. At least for me. Doesn't this happen in life in a similar way? Things are going well, you're on cruise control, got the music up, life's going well, and you hit gridlock. Something changes in a relationship, in your career, and the plans and the goals and the pursuits that you had for pleasure and happiness. Something changes, and now you're stuck. Now you're in gridlock, and you don't know when it's going to end, and so what happens? You start to panic. Got to change something. Got to reroute. Maybe I'll try this. There could be a consequence, but I don't know. Maybe it's worth it. Maybe I'll try a different exit to get off on, and maybe I can reroute my life that way. We have that in us because life has different seasons. He speaks here about the beauty of every season, and many of us struggle to receive that. Like, there are certainly good seasons, but then there are horrible seasons. And he wants to give some wisdom in how we navigate life through the different seasons when we're on cruise control and then when we're in gridlock. And he says this in verse 12 through 13. He says, I perceive that there is nothing better for them to do than to be joyful and to do good as long as they live. And also that everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in all of his toil. This is God's gift to man. See, his response here is that regardless of the season of time that you're in, whether it's a time where you're moving forward or a time of gridlock, that you should be joyful. You should seek to do good, to find what is a gift to you in the season, to enjoy God's gifts to you now, because God has put eternity in your heart. You cannot see the end. No matter how many times you try to look, you will not see the end, but there is joy to be found now. And listen, joy is different from happiness. So much of the pursuits that we have in life on hobbies or building something for ourselves or for the world or visible success or romance and sex or money or whatever it may be, so many of our pursuits are for happiness. It's fleeting pleasures that we think somehow will one day become permanent. But we are called to be people of joy. And joy is not happiness. Joy is sustained, deep pleasure. It is not affected by the circumstances around you. See, happiness is a byproduct of a positive experience in the moment. You're happy, pleasurable. But joy is sustained. And what he's saying here is that joy can be found when you actually live in the moment. See, so much of his journey was thinking ahead. I'm going to pursue this. I'm going to pursue that. I'm going to try this. I'm going to try all these things because I can't see the end, but I know I want to be satisfied. I know I want joy, and I want to experience permanent pleasure, so I'm going to pursue all of these things. He was never looking in the moment for the gifts that were given to him then. So his encouragement here is to take joy and to live fully present. Now, this does not mean that you pretend like your life is pleasurable when it's not. It does not mean that when you're in gridlock in your life, you just paint on a smile and everything's great, everything's wonderful, or that you just choose happiness as if that's some kind of easy command. Because happiness is not always found when situations and circumstances are difficult, but joy can be. See, what he's getting at here is that when you pursue joyfulness, when you want to be joyful by living present in the moment, not everything in your life may be joyful, but you can pursue it. It may not be joyful, everything in your life, but you can pursue joy. That's why he says in the very beginning of chapter 3 that there's a time for everything. So many different seasons of our lives. Just read a few of them. He says there's a time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to break down and a time to build up. A time to weep and a time to laugh. He goes on and on. You see, he's saying that your life is a kaleidoscope of seasons, different times and different experiences. It's constantly shifting and constantly changing. And if you have come to the place where you recognize that God has placed eternity in your heart for a reason, and that reason is to surrender to his plan and his movement in your life as he's building in your life a masterpiece, well, guess what? You can find joy in the moment. You don't have to live your life dependent upon trying to manufacture happiness for yourself by pursuing all the right things and rerouting your life and then trying to cut a shortcut, hoping that there's no consequences. That's an exhausting life. That's the life that he lived. He found it all a waste, vain, But when you recognize that God has placed eternity in your heart, a desire for the end, not so that you can try to work yourself towards it, but that you can live in the moment. You can find joy in the moment. There is, in fact, contentment and pleasure that can be derived. You see, we are frustratingly nearsighted. We can only really see what's around us, but we constantly want to look ahead. We constantly want to look ahead, and his encouragement here is to be in the moment. You see, there's kind of two options, I think, that we take as people. One is for the person who has not surrendered their life to Christ. Maybe they feel that eternity that God has placed in their heart, a desire to see the end, a desire for ultimate joy and permanent pleasure, but they haven't come to see the fulfillment of that in Christ. They haven't come to see God's plan working in their life. And so, typically what that person does, and maybe you resonate with this, maybe you're there, is you think to yourself, the only way that I'm going to find pleasure and happiness in my life is if I take it on myself. If I become God for myself. Take control of my life. M. Scott Peck, in A Road Less Traveled, says this. He says, as soon as we believe that it is possible for a man to become God, we can really never rest for long. Never say, okay, my job is done. We must constantly push ourselves to greater and greater wisdom, greater and greater effectiveness. By this belief, we will have trapped ourselves, at least until death, on an effortful treadmill of self-improvement and spiritual growth. God's responsibility must be our own. You see, this is the pursuit of so many, because we as people are on a quest for pleasure. We want to experience pleasure now and in the great reveal, the finished product of our lives. And we want joy, not just happiness, but deep joy, because we have been given eternity within our heart, and we desire that. We desire to see the end. And so what so many people do is they become God for themselves, and they begin to try to take control of their lives, and they essentially run on a treadmill of self-actualization and self-improvement. I'm just going to try to actualize all these things in my life and happiness, and I'm going to think all these thoughts, and I'm going to do all these different things, and I'm going to constantly improve myself. That is exhausting. Here's how it goes. Try this, try that, do this, do that, attend this seminar, practice this method, because the preacher of our culture says this to you. Inside of you, there's a secret switch, and if you can switch that on, then you'll be happy. You'll find pleasure. Your life will be content. You'll feel the things that you desire to feel. Spoiler alert, you will never switch that on. You will not. Because culture is getting at something. You have in your heart a desire for eternity, a desire for everything to be made right, for pleasure, for contentment, for satisfaction, for joy. But you cannot turn it on yourself. And what ends up happening time and time again is people devote themselves to all these pleasure traps, hobbies and building and success and money and sex. And they ultimately arrive at a similar place. We say this all the time when people think like, oh, that celebrity is really having a hard time and is contemplating life, but they have everything. Why? Because when you pursue these things, trying to switch on that switch in your heart, ultimately the void of your life, the emptiness that you're trying to run away from will become terrifying and become oppressive. That's what he felt. It was all a waste. What was it for? See, if you're here and you have surrendered your life to Christ because you recognize that eternity has been placed in your heart, that there was a void, there's an emptiness that you're trying to run from, but it can be filled in eternity and it can be filled now, then here's something you understand. Your life is not a vapor. It's not fleeting. Everything you do today until the day that you die is echoing in eternity because you've been made for eternity. Your life matters. How you live your life matters. In fact, your life is a miracle. See, a miracle is a surprising, unexpected event. Here's the story of your life. If you have surrendered your life to Jesus, you are on a journey to perfect pleasure, to permanent joy. That is the end of your story, and it is not because you've done anything. You haven't flipped anything on. You haven't done anything right. It's because God's grace has been given to you in the form of Christ on the cross. And if you've surrendered to that, you can be present in the moment regardless of the season of your life and find joy. Because God has given you gifts. He's building a masterpiece in your life, and guess what God promises? He doesn't do anything in vain. So it may not be fun when you're stuck at gridlock, but God is not wasting time on you. He's building something within you. He's near to you, and he provides joy even in those difficult moments. Don't run to the pleasure traps to try to satisfy you or take a shortcut or reroute your life. Trust in the plan that God is unfolding within your life, because he has. You see, one of the benefits that we have that the Koheleth, the preacher here in Ecclesiastes, did not have is our vantage point. We have the vantage point of the other side of the cross, where God's plan is literally embodied in the person of his Son, Jesus Christ. And what do we see on the cross? We see Christ, our Savior, who took upon his shoulders and took upon his life all of our burdens, all of our fears, all of our doubts, all of our pursuits, all of our sin, all of our guilt, all of our shame, and he paid for it. Why? So that we might have a relationship with God and that we might enjoy him now. We don't have to carry all of that anymore. He paid for it. The Westminster Shorter Catechism has a great question about life, and it's this: what is the chief end of man? What is the chief end of mankind, of humankind? The answer: to glorify God and enjoy him forever. That is our end. That is what we've been made for, to enjoy God forever. And guess what? Forever is now. Forever is not in eternity. It is right now. You have not been given this relationship with God by God's grace as you surrender before Christ on the cross, so that one day when you die, you can experience perfect pleasure and joy. You will, but you've been given that as a gift to enjoy him now. That is how we go on a quest for pleasure. We seek God and his presence in the person of Christ. Don't get sidetracked on all these other things. He says that those things will provide happiness. It's okay to enjoy them. Don't live for them, because it's a waste of a life. I want to close with a verse in Psalm 16, which I think is such a powerful verse. The psalmist tells us this: "You will show me the way of life, granting me the joy of your presence and the pleasures of living with you forever." You see, as you go on a quest for pleasure, this is where you find it. This is where you find joy, regardless of the season that you're in. When you go before the presence of God, He shows you the way of life. He shows you the joy of his presence. And look, the pleasures of living with him forever, not just in eternity, but now. See, the vantage point of the cross lets us know that we can live with God now and enjoy the pleasure of his presence. My prayer for you, my prayer for me, is we are all tempted by the preacher of our culture that tells us to run after these different things, is that we would not listen. We would run to Jesus, run to his presence, and find our pleasure and our joy there, so that we might navigate this world well. Enjoy the gifts and enjoy the moments of happiness, but don't live for them. Live for the one who has placed eternity in our heart. Amen.